Morning. Yesterday we talked about right judgment, and we were looking from the theme of not being wrapped up in what others think about us and their judgment of our work for Christ and our ministry for Christ. Paul was saying it's a very small thing what you think of me. He's talking to the church at Corinth. Today I want to give you another angle on right judgment. Let's just have a look again at the passage. 1 Corinthians 4, beginning at verse 3, Paul says, "But with me it's a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by any human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself, for I'm not aware of anything against myself, but I'm not thereby acquitted. It's the Lord who judges me. Therefore do not pronounce a judgment before the time, before the Lord comes." So Paul says, as we looked at yesterday, it's a very small thing how you think about me, but he makes the point, we're looking at today, that he says, I don't even judge myself. He says, so not only am I not too troubled about what you think of me, I'm not declaring myself worthy of great reward when the Lord comes. He's like, I don't think about myself like that. I don't judge myself. He says, I haven't got anything against myself. So he says, I'm not aware of anything that I'm doing that's overtly sinful. He says, but I'm not thereby acquitted. He says, essentially, the Lord knows a lot more about me than I know, and I can't acquit myself. And also, the Lord is the judge, and I'm not the judge, so I can't acquit myself. He says, I understand that actually there's only one judge, and that's Jesus Christ. And the reason Paul thinks about Christ as being his only judge is linked back to 1 Corinthians 4, 1 and 2, where Paul said that the church at Corinth should think about him as a servant of Christ and a stewardship of the mysteries of God. So Paul understood that because he is serving Christ and Christ is the master, and because he's stewarding what Christ has given him and Christ is the source of Paul's ministry, that the only one who has the right to judge how Paul has done in his ministry is not the church at Corinth, is not Paul himself, but it is the Lord. And so Paul lives that way. Paul lives with that mindset of pleasing the Lord and seeking to bless the Lord in all he does. His mindset is also a long-term mindset, understanding that there'll be a day that Jesus returns and he judges, but that day isn't there yet. So Paul needs to continue on in the race, continue on being faithful. The last thing I really want to pick out from this is just to get some balance around what Paul is saying. So he's saying, look, I think about the Lord as my main judge. And he says, I don't judge myself. However, what Paul isn't saying is that he doesn't examine himself and he doesn't test himself to see whether or not he's in the faith. How do we know that? Because this is the first letter to the Corinthians that we have in the Bible. I mean, in fact, there are actually 4 letters to the church at Corinth, but we only have 2 of them in the Bible. The second letter to the church at Corinth that's recorded in the scriptures, in chapter 13, the final chapter, right towards the end, some of Paul's parting words to these very people that he's saying this to in Corinth was that they should examine themselves to see if they're in the faith. And then he says, test yourselves. So Paul wouldn't contradict himself. He wouldn't say, we don't examine ourselves, but then go and examine yourselves. So when Paul says, I don't judge myself, but then later on he says, examine yourselves, he's talking about 2 different things. So to examine ourselves is to look at the life of Jesus. It's to remind ourselves of the faith that we have in him and all of the power and all of the grace that we have in him, and to remind ourselves of his commands and how we should be living if we're in him. We should examine ourselves soberly. We should be asking ourselves, as far as we are aware, what are the motives of our heart? As far as we are aware, what are the works of our hands? We should be examining how we speak to people, how we give to people, how we care for people, how we love people, how we preach the gospel. Are we faithful in that? Are we faithful in the gifts we've used and we've been given that we've used? And so that's what it means to examine ourselves. However, to judge yourself is to possibly have an inflated confidence that you are in the faith regardless and God's pleased with you regardless. And that's not Paul's mindset. Paul isn't complacent. Paul isn't saying, well, I'm saved and I don't even, I'm in the kingdom and I've got no worries about that. Paul's saying, look, I don't think about myself like that. Paul is saying, I'm just seeking to live a faithful life. I'm seeking to be a faithful servant. I'm seeking to be a faithful steward. And actually, we'll find out on the day of the Lord whether or not my motives have been right, my life has been right, My works have been right and they've matched up with the faith that I proclaim to have. So, in closing, in summary, we don't need to worry about the judgment of man on us. We should be free from that, and we shouldn't even worry about the judgment of ourselves. What we should be thinking about is the judgment of the Lord and living a life that's faithful to Him, examining ourselves to see if we're in the faith, but leaving the ultimate judgment down to Him. It might be that on the day of the Lord that we're surprised. Those who maybe we didn't expect would receive great reward will receive great reward, and maybe those who we thought would receive great reward will suffer loss. So let's think about that soberly, and let's walk with that in mind today. Hope this has been helpful for you, and I hope you have a great day in the presence of Jesus. God bless you.